Today is Tuesday, February 21st, 2017. This is a special voting meeting of the Prescott City Council. Welcome, everybody. Roll call, please.
Mayor Oberg.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lamerson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Lozelle.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr.
Here.
Councilman Shiska.
Here.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Here.
All present.
Well, we're back here again talking about something near and dear to our hearts, and that's the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System, PSPRS. We've had numerous meetings on this, and I think we're moving toward ballot language eventually. So hopefully we can talk through some of the issues today. As I understand it, there's no set presentation from anybody. So what I think I'll probably do is go ahead and start the discussion, and then we'll move to the council for their questions and comments, and then we'll move to the public. Read item 1, please.
Item 3A, discussion of the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System funding options and possible adoption of ordinance number 5024-1562, adopting ballot language for a transaction privilege tax to be presented to the voters.
Okay, we're here today to discuss City Council options for consideration of resolving the PSPRS liability and whether we have all the facts and information to move forward with proposed resolution for a ballot measure. So I want to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit as we start this discussion. At issue is whether the ballot language should indicate an attempt to reduce our PSPRS liability or support the option of a dedicated funding source for the police and fire operations. You know, I used to sit out there for about 9 months before I took this chair, and I've spent 15 months up here. And one thing I've heard from the dais on numerous occasions was, why don't we have a dedicated funding source for police and fire? And I think that's where we need to go. I think as we take a look at this and say, you know, what makes the most sense? Going after, you know, the liability for 10 years, or do we really need to look at providing a funding source going forward? Obviously, we know that PSPRS is a very complex subject. We know that the legislature is going to try and start doing something on that this summer. But there's also a lot of attitudes about PSPRS. Everything from, you know, this is the responsibility of the state. They need to do something. They should be paying for this. This is something they gave us. We didn't have an opportunity to have a say in it. Probably all true. We've also had people say that Prescott never paid in everything it was supposed to pay into the PSPRS. That's untrue. We've had other people who have said, well, PSPRS, you borrowed from the PSPRS, kind of like you can with your 401k, and you never paid it back. Well, that's incorrect too. So I think there's a lot of thoughts out there on exactly what PSPRS is all about, and whether they like it, don't like it, think it should be supported, think, you know, somebody else's responsibility, I don't know. But one thing I think everybody would agree on at the dais here and also out there in the public is that we want to have adequate police and fire. They're critical services for the city, probably more critical than any other service that we have. We know that right now our police and fire are understaffed. Remember, we had to take them down last year in 2016 so that we could provide the market pay plan, which was basically an opportunity to increase the wages for police and fire so that they would have the opportunity to stay here rather than going someplace else for better pay. Every time we lose somebody, particularly with the police, you know, that's a significant cost in getting those people retrained. I've been told that it's close to $100 million from the time we actually start to pick somebody till the time they're actually through all their training and their OJT and they're actually put on the street by themselves. We have the SAFER grant for the fire department. We managed to get that this year. It's a 2-year grant. That helped us keep the 3 people that we had that were frozen positions. But we also have 6 other people that were leaving the force, and so we have new people coming in. That SAFER grant is only good for 2 years, and then after that we'll have to see if we can get that grant renewed in the future. Grants, you know, as you go forward, are not always something that you can rely on. So we have to determine whether or not we're going to have that funding in the future, and if we don't, then we're going to have to rely on funding out of our general fund. You know, the police also put in for a grant very similar to the SAFER grant, they were denied. We do know that right now the police department is probably understaffed and overworked. I've heard people talk about having to work multiple shifts, a lot of overtime. There's been some reduction in morale, and I know in talking to the chief, she has indicated to me that she's pretty much flatlined. She can't do much more without getting additional police put on. We're also looking at what we have in the way of customer or the folks that go out and enforce our ordinances. We only have one person there, and I think that even though we've come up with a city plan on that I think is bearing some fruit, we're probably short-staffed there. So as the city grows, we can probably expect service levels to expand. There's what we're looking at right now for North Prescott is probably in the next 20 to 40 years, we're going to see that grow out there. Some people say that maybe by another 40 years, it'll be doubling the size of Prescott. So obviously, if you're going to have more police and fire requirements in the future because of more population, then obviously, we're going to have more funding to support that. I think one of the things I'm worried about right now is we do have a survey that was done by the Yes for Prescott. I think it's a fairly good survey. I think it went out to about 3,000 or 4,000 people. I'd have to look at it again. We might want to take a look at whether that is adequate or whether or not we need a new survey going forward. I think that's one thing that we'll probably be talking about here today. Let me just go ahead and read very quickly what the ordinance says. An ordinance of the mayor and council of the city of Prescott, Yavapai County, Arizona, placing on the August 29, 2017 election ballot the question of adopting a transaction privilege tax of 0.75%, the revenue from which shall be dedicated to the payment of the city's unfunded liability to the Arizona Public Safety Personnel Retirement System, taking effect on January 1st, 2018, and ending the earlier of on December 31st, 2017, 10 years later, or as such time as the city's PSPR obligations are 100% funded. I think, 0.75 seems to be the number we're working with right now. I think that's probably a pretty good number. Remember, we had a 0.55 on the ballot a year ago, which got defeated, and that was going to basically take us out to pay off the plan that PSPRS had given us, and that was going to take roughly about 20 years to pay that off. Yes for Prescott came in with, I think it was a 0.60. It was going to be split between operations and trying to pay down the liability. I think probably the 0.75 is a much better number for us to take a look at it. It'll, if you look at our current receipts that we have coming in on sales tax of 1 cent, that generates about $9.75 million a year, and that's probably the amount of money that we really need to move forward and try and right-size ourselves again. I guess what I'm a little concerned about is the length of the payoff, and I think it's very important that we don't mislead the public as we move forward on this. And what I like to do is throw up a couple charts just quickly to show why I have some concerns. Okay, if you look at the chart up here, on the left side, you have basically our business activity that we receive taxes from. And you can see that starting in 1997, when we went to 2 cents, you can see that we've had increased business activity, which of course gave us increased tax revenue. If you look over here on the right side, you'll see that starting back in 1997, we've had a continuous increase in what we get for the 1 cent. You can see 2 columns there. The one on to the left here, that's 2 cents. And what I've done is I've taken it down to 1 cent because the other cent goes toward paying for streets. And you can see that we continue to grow in tax revenue up until about 2017, even though there was a pretty significant downturn in 2001, 2002, it didn't really affect us that much. But you can see that after 2007, when we're making almost $15 million in tax revenue, that we started to go down. And that shows you that the downturn really affected businesses, and if it affects businesses, they're selling less, and as a result, we're going to get less tax. And you can see that from 2007, I think it's down to 2010, we lost about $4 million. Now that doesn't add to our deficit or our obligation, but what it does do, gives us less money to pay off any of the obligations that we have. Go to the next one, please. Okay, on the next one here, I think the two things that are the most important is, first of all, take a look at the far right column. And that's what we paid in the last about 16 years in the PSPRS. That amounts to about $45,500,000. But if you look at the column on the far left, that's our asset value. That's what we actually have to pay pension liabilities for our police and fire. Now you can see that over that period of time, it only increased $6.5 million. So, you know, one of my concerns is during that time that we actually paid in $45 million, you can see we acquired a $78,500,000 liability. So I think that's what really concerns me on, is 10 years really going to work for us. You can see also the column that's headed off by the yellow, right here, starting with the 103%. You can see that it's gone down continually after 2001, down to where we are currently only 31% funded. And if you look at the other column right next to it to the left, not working, you can see that that's exactly what PSPRS was able to get in returns on their investment. And you can see they had some extremely good years, 17%, 14%, 13%, and that's what they were making on their returns. But we continued to still go down. And so I think right now, in my mind, I'm not certain that the return on investments are going to be able to keep us from not going further and further in the hole on obligation. Give me the last chart, please. You can see here on the last chart, you got kind of a green line right in the middle, and that's what PSPRS, the state PSPRS board, said that they would be able to get on as a return on their investments. Starting off on the left there, about 2000, 2001, a little bit earlier than that, they were making about, indicating they were going to get about 8 to 9%. And then as you go further to the right, that green line goes down about 7.5%. The red line shows what they actually made. And you can see since 2002, they've been significantly underperforming on their investments. And if you take a look at the yellow highlighted area there, the Reason Foundation, which is a think tank that works for states determining pension liabilities and pension plans, they've looked at the market and they say it's going to be very difficult for the state PSPRS to make their 7.5%. As a matter of fact, they think there's only about a 45% chance that in the 20 years they'll make 7.5% or greater. So that's one of the concerns I have is, you know, do we want to go ahead and talk about PSPRS and trying to pay that down over 10 years, which I think is probably unrealistic. I think we need to focus on supporting our police and fire and making sure they have adequate funding so that we can pay them properly, we don't lose them to other cities and possibly states. And I think it's very important that if we're going to be able to move forward, particularly with the fact that the city is going to grow, in 10 years it's very likely that we will not be able to get rid of the 0.75. We will expand it enough at that point. We're actually having to put on more police and fire, more than what we actually think we need right now. I think the last thing I want to talk about, I'm about ready to wrap it up here, folks, is I think we want to ensure the voters that the city is doing everything it can through our city manager to try and gain efficiencies and maximize cost reductions in all departments. And I'll just let city manager talk a little bit about that. He and I talked about it earlier today, and I think we got some ideas.
Thank you, Mayor. I think that the public needs to see that we're trying to improve our efficiencies and be as effective as humanly possible with the resources that we have, and that we will, continuing, regardless of how this goes in the coming weeks, look to improve the way we deliver services. And if that means further exploration of privatization or lease agreements where you have P3 arrangements, we're going to look at those. The other thing I shared with the mayor is those aren't decisions you make arbitrarily or overnight. It takes a lot of analysis to decide if those are directions we really want to head. But I can assure you that we are going to look at those and try to be the most efficient organization and humanly possible.
Yep. And, you know, I did talk to Barry Aarons. He's our lobbyist down in Phoenix. If he knew of any companies or firms that would be able to come up here and help us look for efficiencies. And he gave me 3 names of, I guess, very good firms, but obviously they're going to probably charge us a lot of money. The Reason Foundation does this worldwide. They've been doing this since 1970, and they are free. And so I think I've talked with the city manager about getting hold of the Reason Foundation here in the very near future and talking to them and see how they would be willing to come in and help support us and look for, like I said, greater efficiencies at the city level. That's all I have to say right now. I'll go to the first person I have here is Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mayor. First, let me say that I agree that a dedicated funding source would be, that went into perpetuity or how many years would be good. But said that, we did have an ad hoc committee that came forward that put together with you or by you. And they came up through the strategic plan to come up with this. I think if we change gears right now, it's going to muddy the waters either way. Whether we keep talking about this, it's going to muddy the waters for this. And we need to make a decision and go with what I think the strategic plan, my opinion, what they came up with the stakeholders in town. To address something on the 0.65 several years ago, my opinion, the reason 6.5 lost is because 0.65, was it 5.5? I'm sorry, 5.5, was there was a handful of people in town. They had a louder message, it was an easier message. Just say no, send them a message. My opinion, half of them didn't even live in the city. So this is a city problem. I believe the folks, the citizens need to make the decision to either help us with the debt or the liability. Whether we go with the liability or not, I mean, if we go with the liability, you still freeze up funds in the general fund. And we sunset it, we don't do 100%. I thought that we saw 100% on that. I think that 90 or 95% is what I'd like to discuss, what that ordinance looks like. It sunsets in 10 years or at 90% or 95%. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Orr.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. As Greg alluded to, we had a committee of 3, Councilwoman Jane Wilcox, Councilman Steve Shiska, and myself. We looked at many options that were presented from the public and from the council, really narrowed it down to 14 options. From there, we went down to 6 options, and we included the council on those discussions after. You know, we can't do all of this in the back room because we have open meeting law. So the 3 of us could talk, but we needed input from everybody. So we said, we all need to come together on this. So we went from 14 to 16, and then we started meeting weekly. So a lot has gone into coming forward with these conclusions in a solution from the Strategic Planning Committee. So we have recommended a 0.75 to go for, and that is 75 cents on $100. I had a good friend of mine on Friday said, Billy, don't talk about 0.75, talk about 75 cents on $100. I'm not a mathematician, I get that. So 0.75 for a sunset after 10 years. and that it would totally go 100% to paying down the unfunded liability. Many people have told us, don't parse this. Just make sure all of this goes to pay down the unfunded liability. And there were a couple of other things that we said. Let's keep it simple, the KISS theory. And will it work? We can do a lot of things, and I think we will be able to use many of the things within those 6 options that we came forward with, but nothing except an additional revenue source is going to pay this unfunded liability down to the point where we can manage it. And then the last thing, and this is my concern with the in perpetuity, is that will it pass? And people are saying if it doesn't sunset, it is dead on arrival. And I think one of the most important things that we can do today is to look at this language. I think we're close. I personally, Mayor, would like to look at the language, and let's consider what Councilman Lizelle just said. I also would like to consider, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong in this, we usually pay about $1 million annually just to the pension as far as unfunded, right? I mean, that's our kind of our payment. Unfunded.
Right. The normal cost for the pension is about $1 million.
About $1 million.
Yeah, the unfunded liability is above that. It's to take care of the liability that's come about from past history. The $1 million, the normal cost payment, is just to cover the cost of pensions earned that year.
So 95% of unfunded would be about $1.5 million, $1 million. What would you say?
95% of that. What's 95%?
So if you were 95% funded, what would that add to that $1 million? It all depends on the amortization period that the committee selects. Right now, it's a 20-year closed period. They're going to review that once it's at 15.
So
If we were at 95 today, what would it be about?
I can't do that on the fly, sorry.
So, again, going along with the KISS theory, what if we put a $1.5 million? Would that be a trigger? Right, John, is that what we're looking for, is a trigger that if we hit this point before the 10 years, the tax would be done?
And again, I mean, there obviously the timing from the valuation, the actuarial valuation, right, and by the time we get it, it's 4 months old. So,
okay,
you know, to have it, you know, at an amount less than 100% would make some sense, because then by the time we actually get it, we're probably over that level, but okay, it takes a while to find out and then to stop it. So 95% would definitely be an option.
All right, thank you. And so and this is my last point. Could you put up that slide that shows the red line continuing to go, and then if we start paying a 0.75, where we would be based on the actuarials today in 2017 or 2018?
Sure.
It was the last one in the presentation then.
Not in that presentation.
It was the 7th.
Which there were so many.
Yeah, which?
It was the one that I did. That was.
I think it was February 7th. Maybe.
February 7th.
Yeah.
This one there?
There it is. There it is. Except, let's not look at the blue line. That's using $4 million from reserves. So what we do know is, here's what we know for sure. If we don't come up with a solution, we know that we're going to go at least to where that red line is in 10 years, and that's right below $10 million out of our general fund.
Yeah, it's actually just above $11 million by 2028.
And if we do initiate and are able to pass a 0.75, based on what we know today, which is all we can deal with is what we do know today, we can see what can start to happen. It's not going to be easy. We're going to be struggling for a couple of years. Look how much money we're still paying out of our general fund. So, but with a 0.75, we can actually manage what we need to do. And then down below, the last bar is below $2 million, and that would be the sunset.
Right, and that would be the normal pension costs.
Okay.
At 100%.
At 100%. So 95 would be an even quicker trigger, and then at that time, so if we happen to get to the 95% before the 10 years, we could shut this down sooner. So, Mr. Mayor, I guess I would just like for us to look at that language. Let's put these figures into it, and let's make a decision.
Councilman Shiska.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. The $9,600,000 that you mentioned, which is the 3/4 of our sales tax, was that an average?
No, I think that's about what it is today, right? Based on what we're making on 1 cent?
Well, if we
14%, or 15 million.
No,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. If we do 14.9 million,
Yeah,
let's
it's
just
about
say
14.9
million, it comes out to
Close to
11,175,000. Now that's why I asked you if it was an average or if it was the actual figure. What I've heard from people is that they want two things. They want it dedicated to paying off PSPRS. They want to get rid of that. Now, we're never going to get rid of it because we'll always have employees. But it would get rid of the unfunded portion down to a maintenance level that our general fund could handle. And they also want it to sunset. They want it for 10 years. I've asked people, I said, would you do a tax for a permanent funding source for police and fire? And they said, no way. There's no chance they would vote on a permanent tax. And from my own standpoint, I think that we're getting into the weeds in that situation, because if in fact all of a sudden that sales tax goes down and it's dedicated to police and fire, then what do we do? From my standpoint, with all due respect to my fellow council members, from my standpoint, we need to do what the people want us to do, and that's to get rid of the unfunded liability with PSPRS and move on with life. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thanks, thanks, Mayor. At one time, if I remember correctly, and I think I was reminded of it again today, a little bit ago, we didn't have in the city of Prescott special funds and all that stuff. We had a fund. It was called the general fund. And at that time, roads was funded and paid for out of the general fund too. But the community at some point, maybe around 97, 98, somewhere in that, saw that we weren't keeping up with our roads and we weren't able to repair our roads and such. And they chose to tax themselves with a 20-year deal. And then after that, it was a 10-year deal. And you know, you can always readdress what you do at a different time if the community determines that it's necessary. And what the community at that time did was realize that we didn't have the revenues necessary, because when you have so many departments put in the general fund that are dependent on the general fund, such as your Parks and Recreation, such as your library, such as your general government, and such as your police and fire. You know, when you have police and fire consuming, not that they don't earn it, because they do, but they're consuming 75%, 80% of your general fund, which of course includes our payment to PSPRS, you run the risk by not separating a significant portion of what it costs to have a police and fire department, have a revenue source out of the general fund to where it's not competing every year with those other departments. You run a risk of compromising the other things that the people in the city of Prescott want. I adamantly believe the people in Prescott want to keep our police and fire departments whole. I do not think they are. Here again, we have, I don't know, some sort of a deal that I didn't have anything to do with, but somebody did. It was a survey that was done and taken by, a number of people. And I really think that the people in Prescott, if you look at who we are, understand you need to have police and fire, and understand that we have a liability. And if we don't think we have the right management team in place, you get a different management team. If the management team doesn't think they have a good chief in either the fire department or the police department to bring forward what in their budget they have the ability to contribute to the liability that is associated with police and fire on an annual basis. One of the things that concerns me about hamstringing your management and your chiefs, from time to time, you may have another catastrophic event of some sort, and all of a sudden, because of mandate, you can't take the dollars that you have contributing to police and fire to take care of that, because you have to pay PSPRS instead, to the tune of about $9.5, $10 million, $11 million, whatever the number is, and that concerns me. What I continue to support is that taking to the voters to support our police and fire department, removing a lot of their O&M out of the general fund, thus freeing up the general fund to address other city issues too. And very similar to streets or parks and recreation or anything else, when we come up short, we turn to the general fund. The general fund does subsidize, but what, in my humble opinion, I don't think you fund your police and fire operations solely on shared revenue, grants, and put them in competition with the rest of the city every budget year for the dollars they have to function with. And I think we need to go to the public and ask them to support our police and fire department, and those people will pay their PSPRS liability, and if we have extra money there to pay, we'll pay. There may not be extra money, you never know. And that's just my point of view.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Well, thank you, Mayor, for leading off with your point of view. It helps us frame the discussion, and we can also argue with you. First point is, will the 10 years really work? I think the committee was very straightforward in its presentation to the council in saying we can't tell people we're going to pay down the unfunded liability amount. Truly, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know all the variables in the future, but we can say we will pay down. And the goal is to pay down to a point where we can manage it out of the general fund budget instead of having an extra tax. But in the meantime, we need an additional source of revenue. 0.75 from our best educated estimates and our finance officer there would get us there in 10 years. If it does not, we have the option of going back to the voters with the situation at that time and asking them to renew the sales tax, come back at a different rate, or maybe even for a slightly different purpose. So for now, I think 10 years is the best thing to ask for. People need to know, as Councilman Shishka said, that there is an end in sight, and this has worked pretty well in other situations. For a while, when the state had a big deficit, they put on an extra 1 cent sales tax, but it sunsetted. It went away. And we knew that it gave us faith that sometimes government can cut back and get rid of some taxes, but sometimes we have to raise them. It just depends on the situation. Second point is, from all I've read about the Reason Foundation, they call themselves a think tank, but I would disagree that they are here to help us. They are funded largely by two billionaire brothers, the Koch brothers, who have funded a lot of candidates, and they are described as an ultra-right-wing funding campaign organization. So I would be very skeptical that the information they would give us is reliable. We need more information from balanced sources if we are going to turn to think tanks to help us make our decisions. I don't think we need to do that. We know what the problem is. We know there's an unfunded liability. Yes, it is not Prescott's making, but we have other things in the works. We have a new city manager who's identified many ways to economize our services. We will keep working with the legislature. We cannot count on the legislature coming up with the final solution. Ooh, I hate to use that term. The legislative process is very complicated, and I truly believe the pension reform that came out last year was the product of compromise. One individual I was on a hike with recently said, well, I'm not going to vote for the sales tax because the pension reform didn't get rid of the defined pension benefit option. And I was a little puzzled by that reaction, but then I had to think about the fact that there were many players in that pension reform discussion. And defined pension benefits are very, very important to many of our employees, not just public safety, but all the rest of the employees, many state employees, federal, and so forth. They actually stabilize our economy because people can count on the money they are going to get every month, and they will be the consumers of our society. Look at our population. We're getting more gray all the time.
Well,
Most
some of us.
Well, some of us, right. Some of us go to hairdressers. But at any rate, you can see that a larger portion of our population are getting older in retirement, but they will be the consumers. Those defined benefit plans are extremely important, just as Social Security is important. So I would not rely on the Reason Foundation for information. I think that we can look to what we have heard from people in Prescott. And if we do need to do a citizen survey, I would say it could only be useful as a tool to help us educate and define the message that needs to get out. It would help us understand what are the misunderstandings. We've all heard anecdotes from people. We talked to a few people, but obviously we can't talk to everyone in the community. A survey would give us a pretty good idea of how to, what we need to educate people about. Finally, the other point that was raised is whether we should have a tax that's dedicated to paying down the unfunded liability or dedicated to public safety in general. I'm concerned about creating all these separate funding silos in city government. We have the water fund, and we have the solid waste fund, and we have the streets fund. But we can't trade from one to another. We can't move those silos around. We might be able to make temporary loans, but we still need an additional source of revenue. So as much as I would want to see adequate funding for public safety, I don't want to get into putting them in a box and then saying that's all you get, and then having, once again to say, oh, sorry, we don't have money for the library. The idea behind having a dedicated funding source for the pension fund is that gets that off the general fund plate. Then we can look at the general fund and continue to provide this city with the amenities that we all love: the library, parks, recreation, and we cannot forget economic development. That's something that we have kind of dropped the ball on recently because of financial circumstances. But we really have to look, and we need money to work with new businesses and industries that come in here. Every other community does it. They have incentives to offer. We have nothing. So we really need to look at how we can thrive and grow as a community. And I think the 0.75 sales tax for 10 years is the best option.
Well, since nobody else has put anything in, I guess I'll go ahead and respond again. But again, I think I've talked to quite a few people in the last couple of weeks and said, would you rather pay for PSPRS or would you rather pay for a dedicated funding source for police and fire? And many of them thought about it for a few minutes, and then they said, I'd rather pay for a dedicated funding source for police and fire. So, like you say, anecdotal information. We talk to various people. We hear a lot of different things. So I'll just say that I've had a lot of folks that I've talked to when they were given the option, they had a chance to sit and think about it for a moment. They all went with the idea of a dedicated funding source for the police and fire. And they knew that what was left in the general fund was going to be able to meet the other government functions that we have that are supported by the general fund, and also be able to address the liability. I think sometimes when people talk about sunset, they don't trust government. And they're afraid that, if they keep it out there, then the government, is going to pay something down, then they're going to have it, and they're going to be using it for something else. I guess one of the problems that I have is I don't think we're going to see this thing be paid down in 10 years. So, one thing I can tell you right now on the language, as far as I'm concerned, I'd want to see it be not 10 years. I would just want to see it pay it down to 100%. Because I think it's going to take 16, 18 years. I don't think this is something that's going to be turned around in 10 years or less. And the reason why I say that is because you remember the chart I had up there where the Reason Foundation, I know some people don't like them because they think they're right-wing nut jobs, but the Reason Foundation has a high level of respect throughout the United States for coming in and helping various city governments come up with realistic pension systems and finding cost-efficient ways of running government. And, everybody's got their own viewpoint on that. I'd ask you to go online and look them up and look into them. But they do indicate from their studies that there's only a 45% chance that the state of Arizona, PSPRS, will be able to meet its return on investments 45% of the time and over the next 20 years. That means there's going to be additional debt. We have to look at this last year, they only made 0.6%. They didn't even make 1%. That's going to be rolled out here in the future, and we'll see what we have to pay for that. We still haven't heard from the Parker case. I'm certain that's going to go against us because the Hall case has already gone against us. So we're going to see additional funding there. So in my mind, I can't support this language unless it is purely for paying down 100% of the liability. And I go again to the one chart I had up there where it showed us going from 103% down to 31% today. And all I can say is, what do you see out there? What mechanism has turned that around and we're going back up? And everybody's hoping that if we pay this thing, we start paying in a large amount to the fund against our liability, that we'll turn this thing around. And I think we will to some extent. But I don't think we're going to pay it off in 10 years. Councilman Blair.
Well, I've heard a lot, and I've said a lot. From my standpoint, we've talked about surplus properties and extra monies that we generate in our general fund to be put over towards paying off the debt, and I think that still should be the goal that people hear of us trying to attack right now, along with a 3/4% sales tax. But I keep going back and saying that we need to file a lawsuit against the state of Arizona. I get laughed at, but I really don't care, because until we get our autonomy back to what we need to do as an individual community with a charter, we're going to always be walked on. If I go back and say that once again, we start talking about Mr. Henry sitting out here and all the water meters he's got in our community. And if you start talking about 25,000 water meters that we have at $50 a month for police and fire charged on your water bill for police and fire, you're at $2.5 million per month. That gives you over $30 million a year in operating capital for our police and fire department, which is your long-range goal of having a funding mechanism for your police and fire department. If the state would give us the ability to be able to utilize our charter and our resources the way we need to do that. We're given the opportunity to file a fee on our water bill for water, for sewer, for trash pickup, but the two most severe things that we have in fire and police, we're handcuffed. And we have an automatic funding mechanism to take care of all this nonsense that we're talking about now. No 3/4%, no extra tax in the end. If we're able to just have them let go of our throat, we could do this all on our own. So I'm suggesting not only do we go with the 0.75% for 10 years and paid off to 95%, I'm suggesting we put together a task force team that meets with our counterparts at the state, our legislative people, and our governor to allow us to function as a chartered community to pay off our own responsibility and our own debt. Because I'm afraid after 10 years, based upon us not having the ability, that we may be very much in the same situation 10 years from now if all these funds crash one more time and we still have that defined benefit package out there with not another way to go. We are handcuffed. And frankly, I'm pretty sick of it.
Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. John, could you meet with Steve and I at some point in your office? Or ours, doesn't matter. Can we set something up? Not right now, but, okay. Thank you. Okay.
I think it needs to happen. Thank you.
No, I get what you're saying, Steve, but we need to have legal counsel on that. And I'd like to just have a conversation with John and give him our ideas, and he listens more, but 2 ears, one mouth, but we'll see. Anyway, I guess what I want to ask is, John, this ordinance, are we required to put the recital at the beginning? The reason I say that is because we wanted a straightforward ballot measure. And just reading this, like most people do, they skim. And they're going to see 1%, right? That's all they're going to see, and that's the existing one. And I would just like this ballot measure to get right to the meat and bones of what we're talking about here.
You certainly can.
I didn't know if legally we could omit that.
I think, no. You can delete all of the recitals, some of the recitals, you can change the recitals. It's really, it just sets up the context within which you can take your action. So you can kind of do whatever you want on the recitals.
Do we have any input on taking out the recital and get right to the enactment?
Yeah, I think that goes along with the committee's desire to keep this simple. And so, are you done, Greg?
Yeah, that's just a question there, and then I'm for the 95%. I heard Steve say.
Well, and that's kind of what I wanted to, if we could go to that, to what you're saying. So if we could keep the language simple, if we could do the 95%, I think we saw that would be very manageable within our general fund. And with the dates for the 10 years, I think it ends at December 31st, 2017. Unfortunately, I left mine at my desk.
Yeah,
but
2017.
Okay.
Or 2027.
But I would just like to comment to Steve Blair, because I'm certainly not laughing about that, about what you're saying, because I think that a lot of the autonomy of the city has been taken away, and we are a charter city, and nothing can. Attorney General Brnovich cannot rule on anything until there's something done from our level. So, Steve, I understand exactly what you're saying. And we sat here last week and listened to Tyler give us a litany of things that are being done at the legislature, and we're going, oh my God, where are they coming from?
I keep bringing it up, Billy, because being here in this community a long time, when we had 4 and 5 fire stations and the cops that we had within our confines of our city limits were much greater reduced then than they were today. We have very few police officers over what we had 15 years ago, let alone cops and firemen. And yet we bring on new developments like the Dells, and we bring on Ron James's development coming in. They just started the next phase of Yavapai Hills. And we keep having these demands that are put upon us as a governing body in our charter city, but yet we're not being able to be given the ability to put on anything when it comes to impact fees. We charge impact fees for water and sewer and all these things, but when it gets down to police and fire, we're always throwing mud in our firefighters' face, our police officers' face. We have less people now than we had 15, 20 years ago, and we have no way to control that because it's been taken away from us, and I resent that, in a big degree.
And I really do appreciate that. And the other, what Councilwoman Wilcox said about the economic development, we've spent so much time on this issue. And it's like we're in the weeds. We need to get out of the weeds. We need to be visionary. What can we do for our city? Not only do we need to find a revenue source, we need to grow our revenue. And how do we do that? We see what we can do to bring in good companies. Who the heck wants to come into a community that is even talking about bankruptcy? So we need to get on with this because it's hard to be visionary. I'm quoting our city manager. It's hard to be visionary when you can't pay your bills. And so, Mayor, I would just really like to suggest that we discuss the 95% in the language with the 95% in the ordinance and see what that looks like. And then I would hope that we could move forward and take a vote today.
Councilman Shiska.
Thank you, Mayor. At the end of that first part of the ordinance where it says, or at such time as the city's PSPRS obligations are 100% funded, is that different from 100% paid off?
Yes, Councilman, the funded refers to the actuarial evaluation of the projected liability, the funding available to cover that actuarially projected liability. Obviously, the
Which is
pension,
the 78 million?
currently 78.5 million.
Okay.
And that fluctuates over time as earnings come in at wherever earnings come in, 0.6 or different. Other things change over time as well.
So why didn't we say, or at such time as the city's PSPRS unfunded obligations are 100% funded? Is that a problem?
The funding level is based on the funds available against the actually projected liability. So it's the PSPRS trusts are actuarially at 100% funded. It's not or you could say the unfunded liability is zero.
If you, by the way, if you look into the body of the ordinance, it talks about 100% funded as determined by actuarial value. So the 100% funded is merely a trigger point.
Sure.
Is it a real number? To the extent an actuarial number is a real number, it's real. But in reality, it's going to fluctuate. So in other words, if these can come out quarterly, or
they come out annually. They're as of June 30th each year, and we get them in November, December. So
I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have is that if we express something like this in the ballot language, then people's eyes are going to glaze over because they've been told by various people, we're never going to pay this thing off. And so what we need to do is we need to be very specific as far as what we're paying off with this 0.75 sales tax. So we need to find language that more specifically ties to what people want, which is to pay off our unfunded liability.
well, a couple of sort of that's what this language does. But I think also you need to avoid using pay off because there's no such thing. In other words, even if it gets to 100% funded or unfunded goes to zero, there's still that $1 million
sure there is.
obligation.
There is a maintenance because we've always got employees.
You always have employees. So
Absolutely.
There's always going to be that city contribution of $1 million a year now. So
Well, all I'm trying to say is that this language is going to confuse the heck out of people because other people are sitting there telling them, you're never going to pay this thing off. And so all they see is if we say 100% funded, then all of a sudden they're going to go, well...
But that's why there's the 10-year. In other words,
10-year
it's the earlier
Right.
of. So it's no more than 10 years. However, if we get the report from PSPRS that we've reached that milestone of 100% funded, as it would show on the chart, 100% or more, I guess, could even be like.
And if it happens to be before 10 years, then it goes adios.
Right, and I think the report or the actuarial gets done in June, and we get it in November.
right, it's done as of June, but by the time it gets through the process, we get it November, December.
So for all intents and purposes, it's it's December 31st.
So let me ask you
6
one
months later.
other question, Mark. When we talk about, the mayor mentioned, what did you say, Mayor? They made how much last year? The PSPRS fund?
0.6%.
0.6%. And I think that they dropped their actuarial from 7.6 to 7.5, as I remember. Now that is an estimate of what they're going to make over the entire life of the retirees and things like that, aren't they? Isn't it?
Yeah, it's a projection
Yeah.
for a long-term
That's a
rate,
long-term estimate.
annualized
So
rate.
they may make 0.6 this year, but they may make 14.5% some other year.
Well, yeah, and good point. And just to clarify your point, as you can see back on this chart that was up earlier, in 93, they were projecting 9%, and their actual rate is this very jagged line with an actuarial rate of the red line. And you can see they were well above it for a lot of years. And as the markets changed and losses happened, they started to move this green bar down. And that is continuing. They're looking at taking it from 7.5 in 16 to 7.4 next year. Then if rates start to improve, they'll bring it up. But you don't move an actuarially assumed rate of return rapidly. You don't move it
It's not an annual
5% in 1 year, or you just have a lot of
And that's
shock.
what they're basing our liability on.
That's one factor.
Yes.
Of the many factors that it's based on.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Well, I just wanted to respond to a couple points made by Councilman Blair. One is the use of a charge on the utility bills. The reason the Strategic Plan Oversight Committee recommended a sales tax is that it spreads the cost over the residents and the people who come into Prescott to shop. It just seems more fair because all those people who come in to Prescott to shop or rent a hotel room or whatever, have a meal, also need our public safety services. So they should also contribute to the cost. The utility rates, we already have the highest in the region, and that would hurt some of our low income, mostly seniors. So I would caution against using that. But I do agree with you about going to the legislature and getting back the ability to impose impact fees for police and fire, not just for capital projects, but general purposes.
We always talk about flexibility and just to have the autonomy back to whether you think it's egregious or it's going to hurt the folks that are elderly. When you start talking about water meters, you're starting to talk about people that are property owners, homes, businesses, apartment owners. That usually doesn't get down to the elderly in that fashion. But what it does give us, it gives us an opportunity to be able to manage a 0.5% sales tax that might be more palatable, along with a $20 a month on our water bill. There's flexibilities that we can have both ways. We don't have any at this time. And frankly, we don't even have the ability to do that. And that's what I'm offended by. I think we have a lot of tools. And we talked about, let's just be honest with it. We've talked about a district for our fire department and combining Prescott's fire department with Central Yavapai. The bottom line is Central Yavapai will never touch combining the city of Prescott as long as we have a PSPRS debt. There's nobody that's going to assume that debt and then pass it on to their stakeholders or their people out in the county. If we could finally get it down to where it was a manageable number and be able to have a district called a metro and relinquish that part of the debt that we'd have for fire, then we could handle the police on a regular basis the way we're functioning in our budget now. But all those are open-ended questions, and we have to figure out all those. And if we had all those tools, we could do a lot of great things, but we have none of those tools. Which
Steve, I guess not putting words in your mouth. You're just saying, not suggesting we all agree with the $50 here and there, but his point is they've taken away options for us to even discuss.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to finish my points here.
Thank you.
You mentioned the possibility of suing PSPRS. I raised that a year or two ago because looking at this from a lawyer's point of view, I think there's some liability on the part of the Public Safety Retirement Board. Having read all of the articles that were published in the Arizona Republic several years ago, but there were some members of the Police Association who stood up and said, we've already tried that. Well, I don't know what their cause of action said or how they framed it, but I still think there's a potential that this city and other cities in similar circumstances in Arizona could file a lawsuit. Maybe there is some E&O insurance that could cover it, but it still isn't going to get us to fund the entire problem that we are facing. I mean, Prescott's situation is worse than other cities. Not quite as bad as Bisbee, but it's among the worst in the state. So a lawsuit is a possible option, but litigation, especially involving other plaintiffs, can take years. We litigated against the local government investment pool. Remember that, Mark? Has it been resolved?
Yeah, that was resolved, but it took, like you said,
10 years,
15
I think. Yeah,
years
10
maybe?
or 15 years.
Before we got the final settlements that we got out of that.
Right. So in the meantime, we do not want to be taking money out of the general fund to pay off the pension unfunded liability, and then that would decrease the quality of life in Prescott. We don't want to do that. That's the reason we're asking for additional revenue.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Manager.
Yes, sir.
If I'm not mistaken, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, under the current model of police and fire delivery, we spend in the vicinity of $26 million a year.
That's pretty accurate, yes.
Okay. And under the current circumstances, the 1 cent sales tax gets about $14 million a year.
That's correct as well.
Thanks. Regardless, pass or fail, does the liability go away?
Absolutely not.
Okay. And whether it passes or fails, do we still need a police and fire department?
Yes.
Kind of thought so. You know, here again, we need a police and fire department. Where does the money come from? Part of the O&M of police and fire is paying the liability. It's not the only part of having a police and fire department. Unfortunately, I think you hamstring the ability for O&M if you mandate by initiative that 975 or 11 million or whatever it is, regardless of the need of the police and fire department, it has to be spent this way. You know, whether this passes or fails, we still have the liability contribution. And John, with regards to the conversation in lawsuits and suing and everything else, how far can that go with regards to reality in reference to what we're trying to get accomplished here in a very short period of time with regards to asking the voters in the city limits of Prescott, what are we prepared to do to ensure we have a proper funding mechanism for police and fire? Now, one of the things that Harry said up here is he has a problem paying PSPRS $10, $11 million a year, having watched the performance of the fund that they're invested in. On the other hand, that doesn't mean I heard him say we're not willing to support police and fire, of which they make a contribution every year, and they have to make that contribution every year. So if you could just kind of respond to the legal questions that were posed today with regards to lawsuits and suing and all that other stuff, would be helpful.
Well, I think that if there is a cause of action or a claim that Prescott could make against the board of trustees For the most part, though, those same causes of action would be available to the other cities who are part of PSPRS. I mean, just because other cities or towns don't have, or even districts don't have the same unfunded liability amount that we do, doesn't mean that they haven't. In other words, all of the member cities have the same impact from the investments. So, to me, it's not a function of the city of Prescott, Don Quixote trying to slay the windmill, or David. It would be a David and Goliath issue, quite honestly. We would spend a lot of money fighting a huge uphill battle. If you were to get, and I've said this before, if you're going to look at something like this, you gather together the League of Cities, or you gather together a number of cities independent of the League of Cities and towns, to file some sort of collective lawsuit, because then you're able to have, retain one law firm or a group of lawyers collectively spread the cost out, and challenge those decisions that created, or at least allegedly created, the situation that not only Prescott's in, but all the other cities are in. So that'd be my recommendation one. It certainly, it may take as long as the payment plan, the 20-year payment plan, to resolve the case. I mean, that's the practical reality. It's not going to take as long as our water cases, which seem to be generational. But I'll give you, for instance, a group of cities, mostly charter cities, got together and sued, the online travel agencies, the Expedias of the world, and we collectively. This is before I got here. But it still hasn't been resolved yet. So that's over 4 or 5 years to resolve the issue of whether these online travel agencies were required to pay the TPT and bed tax. So these cases take a long time. If you're thinking the filing a lawsuit, by the city is going to be something that's going to resolve this problem, it's not. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of money. And as I said before, whittled it down to these sort of 6 possible solutions or possible avenues. None of them mutually exclusive. They're all on the table for you. So just because you go one route doesn't mean you can't go another. And let me just say, the standard that to have any cause of action, the standard is it's a fiduciary duty standard. And what the standard is that the decisions that were made by the investment and management of the board have to be evaluated not in isolation, but in the context of the trust portfolio as a whole, and part of an overall investment strategy, and in light of the facts and circumstances existing at the time that they made the decision, and not in hindsight. So we can all say, looking back at the investments that the board got into, and a lot of it was tech and the tech bubble and all that, and that that sort of started the downturn in the 2000s. But quite honestly, if those decisions were made prior to 9/11, 2001, I'm not sure anybody. Clearly, the NSA wasn't able to predict 9/11 happening. So how would you expect any investment manager to anticipate that? So there are some huge uphill battles in terms of lawsuits against PSPRS. Is it winnable? I couldn't tell you right now, because it would take a lot of work just to even get to that point. Will it take a long time? Absolutely. Will it cost a lot of money? Absolutely. Are the chances better if you pool together with other cities and towns or the league and try this? Absolutely. But it's been tried before, and it hasn't been successful. So we do have some negative precedent. So to the extent that you as policymakers decide that you want to take some legal action against PSPRS, then I think it really is on you to gather together all the other cities and towns that want to join in and share the cost, because we talk about how much bankruptcy costs to file, and that's not an option, obviously. from a lot of standpoints, legal and otherwise, this would be a rather expensive proposition. And your chances of success probably are better by doing it collectively with other cities and towns, whether the league takes the lead, whether it's, a joint effort. But that, I think, is on you as elected officials to get together with the other city and town elected officials and say, hey, who wants to join us? I don't have that authority or that power to go to the other city attorney and say, hey, let's all file a lawsuit together. We just don't do that. You're the client, and you have to make that decision. But I think, my best advice to you is if we're going to do anything like that, it's got to be a collective effort.
Thank you for that comment. And then, of course, Mr. Lamar, thank you for your candid answers. Here again, whether we go forward with a ballot initiative asking the taxpayers to strictly limit the amount of tax increase to paying PSPRS, or whether we go forward to pay into our police and fire, we still have to pay PSPRS.
That's correct.
That's just a fact.
That's the part of the cost of doing business. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my only point there is, pass or fail, we're still going to be required to pay the liability. And if we go forward asking the question with regards to whether it's 7.5% or 5.5% or whatever the case would be in police and fire, every year during the budget cycle, we can see what's there and make a lump deposit if that's what we choose to do. But that, here again, I think if you mandate us to have to pay what we collect to PSPRS, you may sufficiently limit our ability on the other side of the coin with police and fire, knowing full well that there are things that can happen in life. So as a manager, you're a manager, respond to that comment. Please.
Yes, sir.
Please.
Okay. Let's start with your initial premise, which is absolutely dead on. We are always going to be in the business of public safety, and it's always going to cost a significant amount of money. Would, in theory, having a dedicated source be a valuable tool? Yeah, probably. I'll tell you one of the concerns I have. And if you had a dedicated source, there's the potential, not this chief or these chiefs or this manager, folks that aren't as dollar conscious and interested in providing efficient and effective service, that they would use that as a pillow for a soft landing and not look at ways to save money because they'd have a pillow of a guaranteed set-aside money to fund their operations. That's a concern I would have about it. Would it be nice? In a lot of respects, yes. But I do have the concern that you might have folks in leadership that took advantage of that. Again, not the people I'm sitting in the room with, but people down the road.
Absolutely.
That would use that as a pillow to cushion their respective departments.
Thank you for your candor.
Yeah.
Councilwoman Orr.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Council. I go back to our recommendation from the committee was that this be a dedicated tax to pay down the unfunded liability, that it have a sunset of 10 years, and that it has a trigger. I'd like to entertain the idea of, rather than a percentage, one of the things we know right now is that our unfunded liability is $78,445,879. That we know. And I think if you ask citizens out there, they will tell you somewhere between 78 million and 85 million because they've heard a lot of different numbers bounced about. I think dollars mean more to voters and citizens than percentages. So I'd like to entertain the idea of, rather than doing 95% or 100% or 95%, that we put a dollar amount on this, so that if our unfunded liability gets to $1.5 million, this thing sunsets. Mark, from your point of view, Which is easier? You try to explain a lot of finances to us all the time. So what is easier when you're talking percentages or a dollar?
I'm not sure I'm the one to talk to about effective presentation, but
I would understand dollars more.
You would
we
understand
try.
dollars. I would understand dollars.
and again, if you do it as the unfunded liability is below 1.5 million or 1.5 million or
Or hit,
below,
it becomes-
or,
all right.
yeah, something like that. I think.
1.5 or lower.
Yeah, that's clear.
Then I would like to suggest, and Mayor, I don't know if I can make a motion on this. I know you want to have public input first, but so I would just like to say that we say at or below 1.5 million rather than go with a percentage, and that it's 10 years, that it is dedicated. Oh, and to, omit the recitals then, because that's very confusing. If people have to read that before they say or yes or no.
Well, let me just clarify
Well,
that.
maybe not omit it,
Yeah,
but let's clarify.
If you look at
simpler.
Section 2 of the ordinance, that's the ballot language. So everything else
would not be
is
on
not
the ballot.
The ballot
Okay.
language is, the ballot language shall read, and it's basically the stuff in bold. The question, a yes vote shall have the effect, and no vote shall. That's the
Okay,
whole
all right.
ballot
There you go.
language. So all the other stuff, we can certainly, we can delete. It's up to you in terms of what the final form of the
Okay,
ordinance looks like,
that
but
makes
that's
sense.
the ballot language.
Thank you, John.
So, but the 1.5 million being, or lower being the trigger,
Whatever you want.
rather than percentage. Okay. Thank you.
Councilman Lizelle.
I just want to reiterate what Billy's talking about. I'll retract my omit the recitals, but I do like the idea of the number. So wherever this ordinance says 100%, it would say 1.5 or $1,500,000, whatever is appropriate. Big 1.5 smackers. I don't know if we can put that in.
Councilman Shiska.
I will yield the floor, Mr. Mayor.
Any other comments from the council before we go to public? Okay. Anybody from the public?
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Finelli, live at 5805 Cinnamon Drive in Prescott. We've been here about 2.5 years. Moved here from Illinois, which is a state that has a horrible fiscal situation because they didn't deal with what they had to do. So one, I thank you guys for dealing with this major issue that we have here. I was someone who didn't vote for the tax last time, and this year I would definitely vote for it because there was a little movement in the state, and it was at the time of last year, the way I viewed it was there wasn't quite enough work being done on it to try and manage it, and I think now it is. So now it's just up to, I think, just marketing it properly, and I think people understand it's a problem that's not going away. No one else is going to deal with it. The state's not going to save us. We have to take care of it. I think we'll be successful in it. And there were also 3 taxes last year as well. There's just one this time, so I think that should help too. Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, can I recognize Bill? Bill is the chairman of our Bike and Pedestrian Committee and has been working just really well with Henry Hash and Ian Madeline, the committee, to do some great things for cycles. Thank you.
My name is Ross Bossoni, and I live at 3410 Marigold Drive in Prescott here. First of all, I agree with the mayor that 0.75 for 10 years is not going to solve the problem. I've been hearing a lot of this stuff about this PSPRS, reading about it, and it seems like the biggest problem is because, what I'm hearing, it's in the Constitution, and the people voted on it. Now, that 7% is ridiculous. Guaranteeing 7% in a stock market, you may as well guarantee your dog will never bite anybody, So that's unrealistic. And I talked to Steve Blair on his program one day, and he said, well, it probably can be solved if you have a measure on the ballot amending the Constitution and letting the people vote on it, changing the 7% and maybe changing the administrative part of it too, because they've already failed. Now, why isn't anybody going that route, trying to get a measure on the ballot to change the Constitution. It doesn't seem like anybody's having a problem getting a measure on the ballot to raise the taxes. You know, that's one of my questions, you know. And then another comment I have is you voted to put on more people under the present PRS, PR, you know, whatever. And to me, you know, there's a saying, if you're in a ditch, you know, and you can't get out of it, quit digging, you know, and you put more people on, you're digging more, you know. That don't make sense either, you know. So those are my comments. I would like to see someone put a measure on the ballot to change the Constitution. And if you're waiting for the legislators to do it, you know, you may as well call the dentist to fix up your sewer problem. They're not going to do it.
To answer your question, correct me if I'm wrong, John, we cannot use public monies to put a ballot measure on the state.
Right.
How about our state legislators?
They can.
They can.
They can. How about putting pressure
Love for
on
that.
our state legislators?
Yep.
You know, I mean, you got Campbell coming.
And these are things that we're encouraging David and Noel to do. That's what they're doing on their ad hoc committee. But we're suggesting there's multiple things we need to do. We can't wait for the state. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, I know you can't wait for the state. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Palladino, I think that proposition to change the Constitution would have to be from state level, correct?
Well, or
Citizens
the
initiative.
citizens could put it on, you know, to a citizen initiative requires 300,000 signatures, something like that. No, you can't use public money to fund it. And this, just like the city council can refer a measure like what we're talking about to the voters, the state legislature can refer a measure to amend the Constitution to the voters, and that's all they're doing. So not you know, no more than we're using sort of government money to refer an item to the voters. What you can't do is use public funds to try and promote one way or the other the outcome. I mean, putting something on, we're clearly using, you know, government funds to attempt to put something on the ballot. What we can't do is advocate one way or the other. And just so it's kind of clear, you know, part of the problem with the idea of a state constitutional amendment, which would amend the contracts and the pensions clause of the state constitution, it still doesn't necessarily get you around the federal contracts clause, which changing the state constitution and then changing a contract or pension of somebody entitled to pension may violate the federal contracts clause. So it's not necessarily the sort of end-all, be-all to change the state constitution. It doesn't necessarily get you around the federal constitution.
And I'd just like to add, Ross, even if we had a legislature that would put this on the ballot to take it out of the Constitution, that cannot diminish nor reduce pensions, even if that was on the ballot and it passed, that would still not pay our unfunded liability that we are facing here in Prescott. So I think that's, so many of the things we're talking about are going forward, but right now there is nothing that's going to change our unfunded liability, and that's why it's really critical that we have a revenue source to pay this down. So, but thank you for your comments. I would agree on the Constitution part of yours.
Okay, next.
Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Metz, and I live on Merritt Street. Now, as a number of you know, I'm sure I've been looking at this for a very long time. The first thing I want to say, because it comes up over and over, and I think we should just stop saying anything about it, just say no to bankruptcy. It is not going to fix this problem. There's so many reasons why Prescott declaring bankruptcy is a ridiculous thing. No person who is familiar with our budget and how healthy we are overall would even consider it to be a reasonable thing to say. So why don't we just stop talking about it? It wouldn't fix the problem even if it was feasible to try it. All it would do, it would be mangling our face, you know, to spite ourselves. So let's just say no to bankruptcy. Would rather not ever hear it again. The idea of paying down the debt using our rainy day fund, ridiculous. We pay them a bunch of money, they go and squander it, It's as if the money never existed. We'd be much better off saving it in our bank account for a problem. I mean, problems come up. Let's hang on to the funds because we don't want these clowns at the PSPRS board to squander the money. Now, in essence, what we're doing, and the idea, oh, we haven't been paying what we've been paying exactly what they've told us for a long time. And we saw long ago that things weren't right, but they weren't telling us how not right. It was only a couple years ago that they let us know exactly how underfunded we were. And then a court tells us we've got 20 years to pay it off. So let's say the credit card company says, here's your schedule to pay it off in 20 years, here's your minimum payment. That's essentially what we're doing right now. Anybody who knows anything about credit cards or any other payment system knows you don't want to pay just a minimum payment. The minimum payment is killing us right now, and it's going to get even worse. So we can either pay it quicker and pay 70, 80 million, or we can stretch it out over 20 years and pay 165 million. It doesn't make sense. So we really, really, really want to pass some measure that's going to pay this down quicker. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm saying this for the benefit of the people up there. Okay, so we know we have to pay this. Nothing's going to happen that's going to remove this debt. I mean, if we change the plan going forward, we still owe this. Even if we did declare bankruptcy, are you really going to tell your cops who have served so diligently, are you going to tell our firefighters that you're depending on to put out the fire that we want to pull the rug out from under the benefits they've already earned? I cannot imagine that any sane person really wants to do that. So again, talking about trying to get rid of it by declaring bankruptcy, ridiculous. We have to pay it. So, Greg, you talked about the 90 to 95%, and you're dead on. If we're trying to sell this to people, and they've heard so many people say that this debt will never be totally paid down because it continues to accrue, then telling them that the trigger point is 100% is insulting their intelligence. So we could make it paid off to 90% or 95% or to less than 1.5 million. But to have the ballot language say that the tax is going to be in effect till we pay off 100% of the unfunded liability, I don't think you're going to be able to sell that. Or there will be enough people that aren't going to buy it that we risk not passing it. And really what we need to do, we've identified that we need this. We need to have language that's going to pass it. So as written, I don't think that's going to fly. 100% won't work. Now let's see. Billy, you mentioned that it's actually 75 cents on $100, and I think we need to really push that because, frankly, I'm not worried about 75 cents on $100 and what this will do for being able to open the library more hours and all that. Well, it's well worth 75 cents out of every $100 I spend. Steve Shishka, you said something about the dedicated funds and what if it goes down. Well, if we talked about doing dedicated funds to pay for police and fire, nowhere has anybody suggested that that would be all that we could use. It would simply be a matter of that would be dedicated to that purpose. But let's back up a moment. The Strategic Plan Committee looked at what are the challenges the city faces, what are the goals we want to achieve. I managed to get to one of those meetings. And under the heading of stabilize the general fund, they looked at why is the general fund not stable. It's because this PSPRS is just climbing and climbing and climbing. So their specific purpose for even bringing this up was if we want to stabilize the general fund going forward, we need to defeat this now. We need to start working on this now so it won't get any worse. And that's why they were looking at a tax dedicated to paying PSPRS. A dedicated fund to paying for public safety certainly has its merit, and the day may come where we want to approach that. Steve, I'd rather not pay an extra 40% on my utility bill. But some number might eventually be good if we can get the state reined in. How many times have you guys heard me come up here when we talk about the state putting shackles on us, and I come up here and say, what if we just say no? So I'm on board with you on suing the state to allow us autonomy. We're a chartered city. What are they doing telling us what we can and can't do? I agree with that. Suing PSPRS, squeeze blood from a turnip. It's a waste of time and effort. What happens if you do win? They'll find a way to charge us for it on our pension payments anyway. So you're just wasting a bunch of money. And I could make a lawyer joke about making lawyers rich here, but I'll pass on that.
You do get awarded attorney's fees if we're successful. So.
Oh, well, wonderful.
Maybe then you can trade that in for mandatory recess.
And actually, just to clarify on this suing PSPRS for breach of fiduciary duty, nowhere in the statute does it allow you to get damages. So it may be sort of a futile effort. It can get you can get them to stop doing something that you think is violating the fiduciary duty, but nowhere in the statute does allow you to get any damages for past bad acts, other than attorney's fees and costs.
Again, and I'm going to go back and say it one more time just so everybody can hear my mouth rattle. Unless we file a lawsuit against them, we are just dead wind sitting here. And we filed a lawsuit, not we, but we were part of it. It took less than 2 years, by the way, to get our autonomy back on our election cycle. Mm-hmm. And we are part of the player in that, watching it happen, by the way, letting somebody else do the heavy lifting. And all I'm saying is that they were chartered cities and they didn't like what was taking place, and we shouldn't like what's taking place to us either.
And I agree. And that is talking about not suing PSPRS, but suing the state legislature and saying, what business do you have telling us how we can fund these things? Because they have really handcuffed us. And we're down to the point where basically the only choice we have to be able to do something about this is a sales tax. And that's all that's left. And we need to start doing it because these payments are just killing us. So we need to come up with not only the language needs to be something that we can sell easily, but we also need to unite behind the idea that if we fix PSPRS now or start fixing it now, things are going to get a whole lot more sane. And I think the idea of a dedicated funding source for public safety is wonderful, and I'd love to see it happen. I think right now we should just focus on PSPRS. The last time it didn't pass, so many people were saying because they wanted it fixed going forward. They didn't want to keep putting money into something that was not fixed. Well, the legislature put a fix in. And starting July of 2017, now we have the opportunity to have people into a fund that isn't going to continue snowballing this problem. All we have to do is pay off what we've already got going, and it's manageable. So pay it off till it's below 1.5 million unfunded liability. Pay off 95% of the unfunded liability, something along those lines, but 100%. I can already see that we're going to lose a lot of people saying, but wait a minute, you said it'll never be paid off, so why are you throwing this on us? So this language, close but no cigar. And last meeting we were saying if any change was made in the language, that we would bring it back to the next meeting for a vote so that it could be vetted thoroughly to avoid unintended consequences. So I would say this isn't quite right. Let's tweak it a little and come back to the next meeting for a vote.
Okay.
And thank you very much, everybody.
Councilwoman Knorr, you got a question?
Yes, Daniel, I agree with you like 100% except for that last statement. I believe we were pretty clear last week that we could talk about it. John, we talked about that. We could come up with the language. We could tweak it around the edges here at this meeting and take a vote.
It's up to you.
Okay.
Okay, next.
Hi, Sandra Smith, 701 Whites Bar. It seems to me like you're trying to deal with a complex problem and apply a simple solution. For the future, we need a way to fund police and fire that isn't going to allow for another unfunded liability. some way to protect that. For now, we want to stop the hemorrhage, yes, and this is a way to do that. It's like dealing with a dirty wound. You've got a hemorrhage coming out of it, you need to clamp that artery off and get it stopped. Okay, this is the clamp. But you got to clean that dirt out too, or you're going to have an infected wound and it's never going to heal. So we need to look at, not today, but for the future, some option, some way to prevent this from happening again. And I don't think that the general fund is the way to do that. I think we need some kind of protected, it doesn't have to be 100% funding, but some kind of protected funding that ensures that we won't get into this mess again. That's my thing.
Thank you. Next.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. Bill Feldmeyer, 434 South Alarcon here in Prescott. I got to tell you that I've listened to this discussion on the radio. I've read it in the papers, and I've listened to folks, and I've talked to folks about it over several months now. And it's the first time I've sat through it here in person in front of you all, and I got to tell you that I'm impressed with the level of detail for which you all have gone through to reach this point today. It's not an easy discussion, and it's clearly not a simple solution, although I think you've simplified it pretty well with the 2 paragraphs that are up there related to what needs to be done. And for myself, I think we just need to do it, get it on the ballot, vote for it, and let's wipe this debt out. I mean, ongoing, of course, we got that. We can't avoid that. But the debt needs to go away, or it's going to break us. We got dealt a really bad poker hand, okay? And you can't just get out of the game. You got to keep playing. And we got to pay to play. Thanks for your level, and let's do it.
Okay, thanks. Next.
Ben Roche. Mr. Mayor and Council, thank you for
Where do you live?
I'm representing the firefighters of United Yavapai County. I'd like to just take a moment and talk about the PSPRS and the reform that happened last year. We're not even seeing what really happened yet. Not all of it is even taking place until July. So to really talk about the trends and how this is going to impact in the future, it's kind of fortune telling right now. When they come on in July and they start utilizing the new system, when all of these changes start happening, we might be able to see some trends on where this is coming. So, in short, we want to say that there's already reform that's happened. Let's give it a chance to take place and see what it starts to do. It took 17 years for PSPRS to get into the mess that it's in. It's going to take a few years to start to get that trend to come back into the right direction. Second off, I'd like to talk about the tax that you guys are talking and proposing. Whether we do it for a pay down on the debt or we do it for a funding source for public safety, it's either him or ha. The city of Prescott needs more money to fund the public safety that it needs. So either way, we need to get something out there to the taxpayers to vote on to get that funding rolling in. Third, just want to say that I'm grateful for you taking full pledge of the SAFER grant and getting those boots on the ground to give the public safety that we needed. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess it's back to the council, and we'll decide on what kind of ballot language we want to have here. Again, I feel still that a dedicated funding source for police and fire is probably the right way to go here from the people I've talked to. I definitely think that we need to do something now rather than later. I think 0.75 is probably the right number right now that I think would work. But I don't want to mislead the voter either to a false sense of security that this is going to be paid off in 10 years. And I can just tell you that if we're willing to say something on the line of pay it down to 1.25 or 1.5 and don't put a time limit in there, that's still definitive. That's definitive enough that when we get there, that's what everybody wants here, is to get this thing paid down to where we're just dealing with the normal cost. Then I could buy that. I cannot buy putting in 10 years because I'm not going to mislead the public. Anyone else? Okay, Councilwoman Orr.
Mayor, I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to make a motion that we accept this ordinance, number 5024-1562, and the language in the paragraph for the ballot. Whereas the City Council wishes to place on the August 29, 2017 ballot a question to be submitted to the voters of whether to adopt a transaction privilege tax of 0.75%, 0.75%. The revenue from which shall be dedicated to the payment of the city's unfunded liability to the PSPRS, taking effect on January 1, 2018, and ending December 31st, 2027, or at such time as the city's PSPRS obligations are 1.5 million or lower.
Second.
As determined by actuarial value.
Yeah, question. So with that last little phrase she put on there, that it ends December 31st, 2027, and or which time it is 1.5, does that open the door for it to go longer than 10 years?
That's why I think you have to have, that bracketed, the earlier of.
I think that's
what
exactly
gets
right.
you into the earlier of those two.
Or ending the earlier
So
of.
that makes it, that's a legal bracket there that says
Yeah,
earlier.
well, the bracketed language that I gave you in the draft ordinance were your sort of options, because if you take out all the bracketed language, it's strictly a 10-year deal. With the bracketed language, it gives you a potential earlier trigger point. That's why I put the brackets there. Okay. So
Then
that
I
was your
would
sort of
amend my
option B.
motion.
I'll second your amended motion.
So your amended would be everything except for the 100%.
Exactly. Let me do it again. Okay, taking effect on January 1st, 2018, and ending the earlier of December 31st, 2027, or at such time as the city's PSPRS obligations are 1.5 million or less funded as determined by actuarial value.
Okay, discussion? Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you very much. John, if I heard this correctly, well, we're telling the voters, and this might require you, Mark, 0.75 at the current rate that we collect sales tax equals how much?
Around 10.5 million a year.
So what we're going to ask the voters to do is to contribute $10.5 million a year until such time as we get the actuarial down to 1.5 million. Is that what I just heard?
I believe that's the intent. I would think we'd want to say the PSPRS unfunded.
Yeah, I think there's a Scrivener change that between, and we'll make these, I assume, it's fair to assume that the changes, the intent is that the changes carry throughout, not just that one paragraph.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to get that on the record. And second, I think that the language in the bracketed or at such time needs to reference or as such time as the city's PSPRS unfunded obligations, because before we were looking at it as a positive,
Right.
now looking
That's
at it as
right, so it's
unfunded
unfunded.
obligations are $1.5 million or less. And then we would strike the word, we would strike 100% funded.
Right.
And then the language
dollar value.
$1.5 million or less as determined by actuarial value, and then carry that
through all the other
changes throughout.
Is earlier in there anywhere?
The earlier of is in throughout. It's that bracketed earlier of. If you look at the question, shall the city of Prescott, this is and ending the earlier of December 31, 2027, or at such time, and then with that change, and then the yes vote will have the same language. That bold
That's
is your proposed ballot language.
Okay, so thank you for your candor on that one. So what we're going to ask the public to do is to obligate the 0.75, which is approximately $10.5 million annually, until the liability is down to about $1.5 million. And Mark, how often have we had a downturn in our collections, and what would be the cause and effect consequence if, for example, We're not obligated to the 10.5 million.
No.
We're obligated to the 7.5 or 0.75,
all of the
right?
revenue generated by this 0.75 TPT would be dedicated to the payment of the unfunded PSPRS liability, and for no more than 10 years, based on the motion. But earlier than 10 years, if the actuarial value comes back in, whatever year, because it's done once a year, at 1.5 million or less.
Okay.
So it's not a guarantee of payment. It also doesn't obligate. It's not a guarantee of payment of a particular amount of money.
Well, it's a guarantee of payment
Of
to the
all of
tune
the
of
money.
0.75 on a sales tax.
All of the revenue generated from that sales tax.
However
is
much
dedicated.
that is on an annual basis.
Whatever that is, 10 million, 12 million, 8 million, whatever that is. It also, by the way, just to clarify, does not obligate you one way or the other to make any lump sum payment in any given year. So you could always, that was one of our 6 options. You can do, you do it when the market makes sense. So you always have that obligation to make up a shortfall, for instance, if that's a desire, but that's a council policy decision.
So what you're saying is we can do more than the 0.75 if we have money available.
Yes.
So, however, we do have the 0.75 that we're obligated for.
Obligated.
And we could also give in more if there was more money left
Yes.
over.
That's the
because of
base
your-
payment. It would just be,
Yeah.
if you sold surplus property and you wanted to do more, you have that flexibility as well.
Thank
Or
you
if it's a
to
good
the
time, we want to bring in some from reserves for some reason we're able to.
That's correct.
Either it's a good time based on the market, or it's a good time because we're at a shortfall, or whatever decision, from a financial standpoint, you always have that option. So but this would mean that if this passes, that all of the 0.75% revenue generated goes to the payment of the unfunded liability.
Okay, so the first 0.75% that we take in sales tax is dedicated. Okay, I got it.
And then, you're right, and then
I got
the 1% still in your general fund.
I got it.
Okay, any further comments or questions?
Can I read this?
Before you vote, you need to read the caption.
Yeah.
Can I read this? Okay. And I'm going to read that part. Shall the city of Prescott adopt a transaction privilege tax of 0.75%, 0.75%, the revenue from which shall be dedicated to the payment of the city's unfunded liability to the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System, taking effect on January 1st, 2018, and ending the earlier of December 31st, 2027, or at such time as the city's PSPRS unfunded obligations are $1.5 million or less, as determined by actuarial value.
And then I think before there's any vote, you need to read the actual caption of the ordinance, are you good with that?
Ordinance number 5024-1562, an ordinance of the Mayor and Council of the City of Prescott, Yavapai County, Arizona, placing on the August 29, 2017 election ballot the question of adopting a transaction privilege tax of 0.75%, 0.75%, the revenue from which shall be dedicated to the payment of the city's unfunded liability to the Arizona Public Safety Personnel Retirement System, PSPRS, taking effect on January 1, 2018, and ending the earlier of...
Strike on.
Wait. Ending the earlier of December 31st, 2027, or at such time the city's PRS unfunded obligations are $1.5 million or less, as determined by actual value. I had it written on the other page.
I think the word should be, instead of obligation, should be liability, to be consistent with the ballot. Right, John?
Yeah, liability.
Yep.
It's an obligation.
It's obligations.
It's obligations there.
So what do you?
Yeah, I believe liability would be a better phrase, unfunded liability. Like you have in the middle of the thing, unfunded liability to
And that
public
was the
safety
motion.
retirements.
PSPRS is always an obligation.
Yes.
Okay, I'll change obligation to liability.
Okay, does everybody understand what we're doing now?
Yep.
Okay. Vote, please.
Passes 6-1, Merrillberg dissenting.
Okay, I want to thank everybody who's worked to bring this ballot initiative forward. With a lot of hard work, a lot of time. We still got more work to do on the strategic plan. While this takes care of one element of it, there's still other elements there that we need to discuss and work on. So I know the committee will continue to work on those, and we have now left this up to the voter. Thank you, everybody, for coming.